Oh, that was you. Nope.
Okay.
So.
Rachel, I'm just gonna start in like a minute. Is that okay? So many people are like. Good morning, everyone. If you could all come, please take a seat. We're about to get started. Okay, good morning. My name's Christina Sharp. I am a graduate student at the University of Iowa, and I'm so excited to welcome you to the Becker Memorial Conference this morning. Today I have the great pleasure of introducing Dr. Erin Donovan, who is an assistant professor in communication studies at the University of Texas at Austin. Dr. Donovan has won numerous top paper awards, the IARR Steve Duck New Faculty Award, and many other accolades for her research. Having published over 25 peer-reviewed journal articles on both interpersonal and health communication topics, it's no surprise that Dr. Donovan has a lot to offer us regarding the conference theme, Interesting Questions in Health. Specifically, Dr. Donovan specializes in the way individuals disclose, avoid, and make sense of information while coping with stress, illness, and uncertainty. When she's not conducting research and teaching, Dr. Donovan loves spending time with her sweet and busy 2-year-old daughter, listening to live music in Austin, and walking the trails at the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center. Personally, I couldn't be more excited to be in the audience today. Dr. Donovan is an outstanding role model and in conducting rigorous and timely research. Let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Erin Donovan, who will now deliver her presentation on Coping Through Communication, Coping with Communication, Collective Uncertainty Management in Health Contexts.
Thank you. Thank you, Christina. Well, thank you so much for having me. I have to say what an honor it was to be invited and how pleased I am to be a part of this conference. Christina did such a nice job introducing me, so you have a little bit of a sense of what I do, but I wanted to share with you some of the scholarly interests that I have and some of the theoretical currents that have really guided me and express my appreciation for the theorists who have been the foundation upon which my work has built. Those of you who are interested in interpersonal health communication are going to recognize all of these names, of course, but I'm interested in disclosure and avoidance, especially in interpersonal and health contexts, and to a great extent, disclosure and avoidance are all about uncertainty management. Some people would argue that they're all entirely about uncertainty management, and my interests lie primarily in how people are coping with serious illness, chronic illness. And I've studied a variety of health contexts, HIV/AIDS, prenatal health, but most of my research looks at cancer survivorship, so I'm mostly going to be talking about people who are coping with cancer. And one of the reasons why I'm so interested in cancer survivorship is because it is a type of health context that is very much characterized by a lot of uncertainty. So these are some of the works that I'll be referring to, and of course I have to give a special thank you to Professor Afifi and Professor Afifi for what in my world my students just call the purple book. So it's like, where's the purple book? Who has my purple book today? So we'll be talking about the this type of work. These are the types of sentiments that I come across that you may have heard, that you may have said in your own life. It's hard to talk to people about illness, about health issues. I wish I knew how to talk about things with my family. I'm not sure I want to talk about it. I need someone to help me understand this, what's going on, how to make sense of this information. Where can I find out? Where can I find some good information? And these are concerns that people have that really move me for personal reasons and for scholarly reasons. So if you don't study uncertainty, which you might want to because it is awesome, here is a definition. Uncertainty, and again, I'm looking at health context. Uncertainty in health context is a person's perceived inability to make sense of health or illness-related information. And it is feeling unable to predict or explain your circumstances. So usually when we're studying uncertainty, we're considering the perspective of the person who feels uncertain. So it's not my job to tell you if you're uncertain. If you feel uncertain, then you are uncertain, if you can't really make sense of what's happening. And uncertainty arises from a number of sources. Your symptoms are ambiguous. You're not sure what to make of them. The healthcare system is incredibly complex and hard to navigate, and you don't know how to get through all of the paperwork, and you don't know who to ask your questions. And so there are just a number of things that really characterize illness as a time that is marked by a great deal of uncertainty for people. So a whole host of research has established the premise that uncertainty is a prevailing experience among people who are coping with illness like cancer, as well as others. And theorists generally will argue that many people experience uncertainty as a negative state. So uncertainty makes us anxious, we don't like it, we want to minimize it. It's frustrating when you can't make heads or tails of what your doctor has told you. But we also know that sometimes people will embrace uncertainty, they will appraise it positively. You might not want to know your test results, or you don't want to know them right away, or you don't want to know if you have a genetic mutation. And my undergraduate students are always very skeptical about this whole appraisal of uncertainty, and then I say, okay, well, if you or someone you know has ever had a pregnancy scare, and you didn't want to take the test because you didn't want to know, and they're like, oh, yeah. So we also know that uncertainty can be appraised neutrally, so it's just there. You know that there are things you don't understand, but it's not the primary negative or positive thing that you're experiencing. So as communication scholars, we're very interested in uncertainty because uncertainty is managed through communication. If you're uncertain, what do? You ask people questions, you go online, you find information, and you try to seek answers to minimize or reduce some of your uncertainty. But because communication is so complex, sometimes communication can actually arouse uncertainty, it can contribute to uncertainty. You go and get a second opinion, and it turns out the second opinion conflicts with the first opinion that you got about your diagnosis or your treatment options, so you're not sure what to do. Or you talk to one person in your family about your medical history, you talk to someone else, and that information is conflicting. So I study uncertainty against this backdrop of theories like stress and coping, and communal coping. If you take a look at some of the research that is guided by Lazarus and Folkman's stress and coping paradigm, which is very much predicated on the idea that when we're exposed to a potentially stressful stimulus, we go through the appraisal processes of primary appraisal. How bad is this? Is this a threat to me? What is at stake? What do I have to lose? And then we go through the secondary appraisal. If we have decided that that initial stimulus is a stressor, we're going to ask ourselves, what am I going to do? What resources do I have to cope with this? What is available to me? There's some evidence that in times that are characterized by a lot of uncertainty, this primary and secondary appraisal process is difficult. And that makes sense, right? Because you don't know what's happening. And so it's hard to decide, how bad is this? What am I going to do? What's going to happen to me if I choose this coping route? Do I have the resources to deal with it? Among women who are coping with breast cancer, there's also evidence that if they report that they have higher uncertainty about their condition and they feel less control over their circumstances, then they are more likely to engage in certain types of coping behaviors. So again, if you're not familiar with this type of research, we can categorize coping behaviors into things like emotion-focused versus problem-focused, and escape avoidance versus active coping. And if you have more uncertainty and less control, you may be more likely to engage in emotion-focused coping, which is distracting yourself and pretending that this isn't really happening, and asking your friends to keep your mind off of things, or engaging in denial, or turning to religion, or turning to alcohol, instead of things like actively attacking the problem and trying to find solutions. So the uncertainty and the coping processes are very much interrelated. Now we have these theories about uncertainty management, and Michelle's theory of uncertainty and illness is one of the big ones, Brashear's theory of communication and uncertainty management as well. They tend to focus a lot on individual coping with uncertainty. And this is similar to the research trends in the coping literature, which focuses mostly on individualized coping. And then recent theorists have been looking more carefully about how people engage in coping together, so communal coping and collective coping and social support processes. Brashears et al. Argued several years ago that despite the pervasiveness of collective uncertainty management processes, so people are doing things for you to help you manage your uncertainty, or you are seeking assistance through communicative acts, assistance to manage your uncertainty, we don't really know much about this collective uncertainty management. So this has been kind of in the back of my mind. And I remember asking Dale at one point, well, what about if I'm managing my uncertainty, how is that affecting your uncertainty and other people's uncertainty? And Dale said, well, we don't really know. And he said that would be a good dissertation topic. And I went a different direction for my dissertation, which was, that worked out fine. But I'm still really interested in this. So it's just been kind of sticking with me. So on that trend, on that theme of coping, uncertainty, and control, I want to share with you some findings from one of the studies that my team and I have done. This was a study of people coping with cancer, and we did focus group interviews and one-on-one interviews. We asked them about the uncertainties they had about interacting with people and some of the resources that they used and the questions that they had about talking about their cancer. We took a grounded theory approach. And one of the broad conclusions, this grounded theory that we developed, really had to do with the idea of control. So we noticed that people were talking about cancer as this time that was characterized by a great loss of control. You've lost control over your body, right? Your body has turned on you. You may have little control over your treatment options, either because your cancer is a specific type that only has one or two potential routes, or because your HMO limits you in terms of where you can go for treatment. You may have financial concerns. You may have lost control over the fact that you have to take 6 months off of work. We had participants talking about the loss of control they felt in their personal and social lives. One woman said that she and her husband had to cancel their symphony subscription for the season, which was really disappointing to her because she couldn't be in an environment where she was around lots of people who could get her sick when she had a compromised immune system. So all of these things make people feel as though they're out of control. And this is consistent with other literature. What was interesting to us was we noticed that people talked about managing their communication as a way of gaining or regaining some of the control that they had lost. So there's so much I can't control, but you know what? I can control who I talk to about my cancer, and I can control the way that I tell them and when that happens, and I can control whether to do it before or after my brother-in-law's wedding. Some examples of this, Paul, he's an older gentleman who was still very active in his career, and he was a businessman, and he was wearing a port for his chemotherapy, and he knew that his clients could see it, and they were curious about it. So we saw some of Paul managing other people's uncertainty or perceived uncertainty. He says he would say to them, I'm doing chemo for my colon cancer. We didn't get it quite as soon as we'd like to, but I'm in a good statistical group. So kind of reassuring them, I'm still going to be here. I'm going to be working with you a year from now, don't you worry. Amos was quite a character. Amos was talking about how he tried to regain some control over his social interactions, and one of the ways he did this was, he said to his wife, he says, when I was up getting my chemo, I didn't want my wife hanging out there. She'd come and sit there and knit, and I was like, get the hell out of here. And he said it in an affectionate way. It looks kind of mean, but he was affectionate about it. And he said, I just didn't want that. It was kind of like a death watch. I don't know what it was, but when I was up getting my chemo, that was my world up there, and I was working them nurses, and I didn't need anybody. And so Amos wanted to go and flirt with the nurses. They were, I guess, young and cute, and that made him feel more vibrant. And that was a way of regaining control over the fact that he had lost so much of who he thought he was. Now I'll go back to the model for just a moment, because the other issue that comes up is we notice that there are limitations. If any of you is at all a control freak, you know that you can try to orchestrate things as much as possible, but some things are just beyond your control, and we're supposed to be able to accept that, right? So we see that people are running into these constraints on how much they can actually control their communication and control the communication about their cancer. For one thing, you can't really control the responses of others. People try to say, well, I'm going to deliver the news this way because I want to make sure my kids don't get really upset, or I don't want to traumatize people. But you don't really, that's not your call. So people are going to say things to you that are going to surprise you. The conversation is going to go in a direction you may not have anticipated. And then we saw some boundary turbulence. So folks who study privacy management talk about boundary turbulence, where if I bring you into my boundary of my private information about my cancer, you may then do something with that information that I don't really like, that I don't really appreciate. So there could be some leakage. There could be some spreading of that information. So we had found this, and then just recently I came across this advice column where a woman wrote in, and she's describing some of what we had seen in our research. And she says, "Dear Carolyn, recently I had breast cancer diagnosed at an early stage, but will still require surgery and other treatment. I've told few people. One was a friend of more than 20 years who then told an acquaintance, someone I never would have told. There is so little I can control about this process, but this is the one thing I should be able to control, especially given that I'm a very private person. I was very angry that my alleged friend told someone else. I didn't tell her not to share, but no one should need to be told that. I don't believe that she was being malicious, but still, she didn't have the right." So she goes on, she's very frustrated. They've been friends for 20 years. How could she not know that I wouldn't have told that person? And then the advice columnist goes on to say, "You've been friends for 20 years. How did you not know your friend wasn't going to be a big blabbermouth about this?" Like, why are you surprised? But she does also then say, look, when you are dealing with something so big, sometimes it's the little things that you feel like you can really manage and deal with, and those are the ones you fixate on. Now, I don't know that I would argue that communication is a little thing, but I get what she's saying, and I think that speaks to some of the findings that we've had. So why do people talk about their illness? Why do people talk about their cancer? There are a whole number of reasons why people feel that it's worth talking about this above and beyond some of the findings that we have about control. So catharsis, you want to get it off your chest, you need to vent a little bit. If you want to seek help, you need some support from people, you need to let them know what's going on, at least to a certain extent. A lot of people will talk about a duty to inform, and this is something that I'm going to come back to later in my talk. So I may feel a duty and obligation to tell you for your own safety. So HIV/AIDS, something I need to tell you so that you can take care of yourself. But cancer, in our studies, this tends to be more about, it's my duty as your mom, it's my duty as your friend to live up to these expectations that we have for trusting each other. I might want to educate people or advocate on behalf of my condition. I might want to test people's reactions before I tell them the good, bad, and the ugly of what I'm dealing with. I want to see how they're going to react to maybe some of the softer information. And then, of course, disclosing is one way that people become more intimate. If I see someone that has also experienced my health condition, I may feel a sense of similarity and solidarity with them. So all of these are reasons. I have been very interested in this notion that people make plans for disclosing. So we know that people have reasons to do it, reasons not to do it. Kathy Sharmas has researched illness disclosure, and her book was one of the ones that I showed you on my second slide there, Good Days, Bad Days, The Self in Chronic Illness and Time, and her work is just wonderful. And she talks about the distinction between spontaneous disclosure, where you just blurt it out, and protective disclosure. And sometimes protective disclosures are very clinical, what's called informing, where you really just give people the facts and you just say, this is the medical information. But sometimes you do what's called strategic announcing, which is where you see some of our participants talking about how you package it and you think about, what do you really want people to take away from the message? You want to tell them not just what you have and what the diagnosis and prognosis is, but you also want them to know, here's how I'm feeling about it, and here's how I want you to treat me, or here's how I want you to react, or whatever. The other thing that Sharma says is that this telling, this disclosing, does not end. So when we're talking about chronic illnesses, this is something that goes on. And she says, in the case of chronic illness, the telling, chronically ill people must tell and retell their news to many people and frequently do so at each step along the path that their illness takes. And moreover, they must live with the telling. So this becomes part of your narrative. And you may have new people who come into your life that you have to, or you want to disclose about your health status, or things have changed, so you need to update people. So I think that this idea of the ongoing element of communication and disclosure is important, especially because communication theorists like Brashears argued that in chronic illness situations, the uncertainty is also chronic. The uncertainty is ongoing, and it can change. It can heighten, it can lessen at various points in the illness trajectory. So along these lines of disclosure and uncertainty management and some of the interests that I have in how people manage others' uncertainty, I've taken up this interest in confidants. We know a lot more about disclosures than we know about confidants, and obviously it makes sense that we would start by looking at disclosures and what disclosures are trying to do and their risks and rewards and reasons for disclosing. But what I think is interesting is when I disclose to you, then I am providing you with new information, which can then arouse a great deal of uncertainty in you. So you're learning about the fact that I've been diagnosed with a serious illness, and you may have all these questions like, when did this happen, and how long have you known, and what does this mean, and are you going to be okay, and what can I do, and why are you telling me this way? So I have these questions about the medical uncertainty as well as the personal and the social uncertainty. So we've been working on a series of studies about parental disclosures, and these were specifically looking at young adult confidants. So if you try to find information about how parents talk to kids about illness, you're mostly going to find information about how parents talk to little kids. So you're going to find things that say, use body part terms and use words that they can understand and say things like, mommy is sick, but I'm going to get help from the doctor. And obviously that makes sense. But we don't really know much about how parents might be able to talk to older kids, which I think is problematic because if you think of kind of the typical age range where somebody would be diagnosed with a serious illness, if they're older, middle-aged to older adulthood, their kids probably aren't very, very young. And there's evidence that older kids tend to be confidants more so than younger kids for reasons that I think make sense. So we asked young people, these were undergraduates, to report on times when their parents had disclosed important news to them. And we asked them to describe in great detail. And we have a lot of different topics, but almost 60% of them pertain to health topics. So usually it was the parent disclosing that he or she had been diagnosed with an illness or the other parent had. And I'll share a couple of examples with you. So about 5 years ago, my mom was diagnosed with breast cancer. It was Christmas break, and my family was driving back from my grandparents' house where we had spent Christmas. On the car ride home, she told my brother and I that she was going to have surgery because the doctors thought she might have cancer. She said she was still optimistic and that this was just a test procedure. She told my brother and I that we should not worry because she was going to be fine. She told us we should be praying about the situation and for healing. I remember it being a serious conversation, but I do not remember if she cried or not when she told us. At this point, though, she was not about to have a serious surgery, though. Another example, my mom was going to the hospital to get checked up too many times. I started to think that something serious was wrong with her, and she didn't want to let me know. And then one day I asked her why she was going to the doctor so much. She avoided the topic for months. Until one day out of nowhere, she told me she had a tumor in her uterus, but it wasn't a threat if it didn't grow anymore. She didn't look at me when she spoke. She knew I'm very sentimental, and she waited so long to tell me just so I wouldn't worry for her. And now all we have to do is wait. So I think these are so interesting because there's so much going on here. You're not just saying, this is what I have, but you're saying it in a certain way, and the kids are remembering it a certain way, and they have these memories kind of embedded, these flashbulbs of what happened. So we thematically analyzed the responses. We also asked them things like, what do you think was successful about this conversation? What was unsuccessful? What would you do differently? What questions did you have? And I'll share with you just a couple of the themes that are most relevant to my talk today. You saw the one participant describing how my mom waited so long to tell me for a reason. So we noticed that people were talking about the idea of a delay. And we took some of these statements, we created some scales out of them, and assessed the extent to which these features of the disclosure predicted whether confidants felt that the disclosure was handled appropriately. So we used a scale of communication competence. The greater that the participants perceived that there had been a delay in telling them, the less they thought the disclosure was competent. So there seems to be a temporal element that's important to confidants here. They also noticed or seemed to have some ideas about whether their parents had put some time and thought into the conversation. So my parent, obviously had thought that they should do it when we were all together, or they wanted to make sure that we weren't going to have any interruptions. And I know that she had probably thought about how I was going to react. And so we asked about this idea of planning, and the greater the perceived planning on the part of the parents when disclosing, the higher the perceived disclosure competence. So people seemed to appreciate that. Now, one of the reasons why I'm interested in this is because parents struggle with how to talk to their kids about such serious and important news. And they say that they want to disclose the right way, which, I mean, that could be so many different things. And I thought it was notable that our participants were critical of the disclosures, and they pointed out the things they thought their parents had done well and had done relatively poorly, but they were also pretty sympathetic, and they thought, you know what, I know she waited, but she was just doing it to help me. And I know she seemed kind of overprotective, but what are you going to do? This is just a really stressful thing to talk about. Or I wish my mom hadn't broken down so much in front of me because that was hard to deal with, but it is a sad topic, and I understand that. So the broad takeaway that has been kind of feeding into some other questions we have about this is that there seems to be this assessment that confidants make about disclosures in terms of what it does for their own uncertainty, how it arouses uncertainty in them, and how their parents are managing this uncertainty that they have created and then are subsequently trying to mitigate, perhaps. Another issue that was very important to our confidants was the extent to which they could access additional information from their parents. So did I feel like my parent had taken this topic off the table? Like they gave me the news and then they said, I don't want to talk about it anymore, it's done? Or did they say, okay, if you have any questions, please ask either at that time or down the road? And we found that confidants really wanted to be able to ask their parents follow-up questions and access additional information. And the disclosures were rated higher in quality to the extent that they could do that. So those of us who are interested in disclosure are often also interested in avoidance. And this is a tweet that caught my eye. This woman says, I hate having to hide the fact that I'm upset because I don't want to discuss it or because I don't want to hurt anyone. And this catches my eye because it has to do with avoidance and coping with something stressful and being upset and having reasons for not communicating something to people. Now, just as I've been interested in the confidant's perspective of disclosure, I'm also interested in, are you not hearing me anymore? Nope. Oh, thank you for letting me know. Is that better? Oh, okay, good, thank you. I'm also interested in the perspectives of the avoided. So again, we know more about people who are avoiding conversations than about people who are avoided. And so we've done a little bit of work looking at people who receive topic avoidance messages. This was a study where we described a scenario to people and we said, your friend is coping with something really stressful, you know about it, but you don't know much, and you bring it up during a conversation, and then your friend says to you, I don't want to talk about it. And we had different types of messages, different message instantiations to basically communicate this is a topic avoidance move. And then we asked people, what do you make of that? Why do you think your friend said that? We asked them a bunch of different questions about how they would respond. Not surprisingly, given the way we framed the task, the most frequent interpretations of that were, well, my friend doesn't want to talk about it because it's just stressful. It's hard to talk about. They need some time. They need some space. It's too emotional. They've already been kind of mired in these negative emotions, and talking about it would just make it worse. So I think they were pretty, again, sympathetic. They weren't taking it terribly personally. We also noticed that there can be some ambiguity in these topic avoidance messages. So again, this issue of uncertainty, if I avoid talking about it with you, you might have some uncertainty about why. Has it gotten worse, or do they not trust me with the information? This, to me, is kind of an interesting practical takeaway that the more potential explanation somebody has for your topic avoidance, the more likely they are to bring it up again. Because they think, well, maybe it's because they're mad at me, or maybe it's just bad timing, or maybe they're just having a rough day. So if you are coping with something stressful and you really don't want to talk about it, then give people a very clear reason why, and don't let them have much uncertainty about why you're avoiding the conversation. It's kind of that's my rule of thumb that I have received from this study. All right, so I'm thinking about these issues of how people are disclosing and receiving disclosures, and how people are avoiding and receiving avoidance messages, and how they're coping with illness. And I just keep thinking, man, that seems like a lot of work. And you already have all of this stress to deal with, and then the communication can be hard on top of it. And then you see all these websites that are like, talk to people about your cancer. And I think that makes sense, but then I also think, aren't you just giving people one more thing to do that is also stressing them out? So as we were doing our interviews with cancer survivors, I was thinking about this idea of work. And fortunately, there is a theory about work during chronic illness, and it is called the theory of illness trajectories. So any of you who do grounded theory research cite Strauss and Corbin all the time, and you cite Glaser and Strauss because they are the folks who have codified grounded theory principles for us. But of course, when Corbin and Strauss were working, they were also interested in conceptual issues, not just methodological issues. And Juliet Corbin is a nurse theorist, and Anselm Strauss was a medical sociologist. And one of the things that they did was publish a book called Unending Work and Care, The Self in Chronic Illness and Time. This was a study where they followed couples. They interviewed couples and they observed them, and they wanted to see what people were doing to manage chronic illness in their home. Because as more and more people were diagnosed with chronic illness, this book was published in 1988, people weren't just being treated in hospitals or care facilities, they were being released and sent home, and they had a lot of work they had to do for themselves. And Strauss actually had some previous interests in healthcare organizations and occupations and how people manage workflows in health settings. So they were developing this idea of work. So they noticed that chronic illness is persistent. It's one of the defining features of it. It is unpredictable to a certain extent, and it requires work. Their definition of work was basically a collection of tasks that various people are responsible for during the illness trajectory. This is hard work, it is unpaid work, it is divisible labor. And they talked about 3 distinct lines of work that people engage in when they're coping with chronic illness. The first is called illness-related work. And illness-related work is all the stuff that you have to do to manage your illness at home. So testing your blood sugar, checking your blood pressure, taking your medications, going to physical therapy, going to your follow-up appointments with your doctor. They talked about biographical work, which is the second line. Biographical work is resolving all of the identity issues that crop up when you're coping with something like a serious illness. Who am I now? What does it mean if I have to stop doing the profession that I love and I'm so invested in? Who am I if I can't be a marathon runner anymore? What if I have to resign? And then they talk about the day-to-day living or the everyday life work. And this is just the stuff that grown-ups have to do. So day-to-day living work is washing the floors and unloading the dishwasher and going to the grocery store and balancing the checkbook. And amid all of the everyday life work is the work that is specific to the illness. So I reread the book and I'm trying to figure out, okay, well, how does communication factor in here? And Corbin and Strauss talk about communication in the theory. They actually describe communication as a pivot point around which all of the other lines of work happen, because you have to do what they call articulation work, meaning you have to coordinate with people and set goals and say, okay, well, who's going to pick up your prescription and who's going to pick up the kids from school, and sometimes you have conflict about who's responsible for what. But I just keep thinking, but sometimes the communication is hard too, right? And sometimes the communication is work, and they didn't really get into that, which is fine because that's not the lens that they had. So one day during one of our focus groups, we were moderating, this series of comments came up. Martha says, if you're not comfortable telling the people close to you, how are you going to be comfortable in a support group or with a mental health counselor? And Holly says, because it's a secret thing that usually stays in the room. And Martha says, yeah, because you may feel like crap and you don't want your family to know you feel horrible, but it'd be easier to tell a stranger that you feel horrible. And Holly says, well, sometimes you don't want to reveal your inner feelings to your family for fear of scaring them. And then Martha says, sounds like a lot of work if you're sick. So then I'm trying to I'm in the focus group and my research assistant Andy's on the other side of the room and I'm trying to be cool and I'm like, and he's like, because we've been talking about these work issues and then I'm hearing it coming up and I'm like, I'm not crazy, this is actually happening. But we kept it cool, we just took our notes and then went on from there. so then we started incorporating some questions about this into our interview guide. And then we developed this concept of communication work that we wrote about. And we argued that the concept of communication work problematizes communication. So it doesn't just take it for granted as this background process that happens, but it is a collection of interpersonal and informational tasks for which various parties are responsible during the illness trajectory. We described 4 pillars of this additional line of work. 1, communication work is effortful. Now, not all communication is work, but some communication is, and it's hard, and it is sometimes a burden. You have to help people understand what you're going through. You have to manage awkward attempts at social support. You have to coordinate the flow of information. We noticed that people describe this idea of duty, which, as I mentioned, comes up in the illness disclosure literature, and people talk about feeling responsible for updating people and keeping them informed and doing it the right way. So there's a sense of communication competence, which I think is interesting. And our participant says, if you're going to communicate this, you better do it well, because you feel this sense of obligation to manage your friends' and family members' emotions. The third pillar is preparation. So people talked about preparing for conversations, planning for talk. And there's some other research on imagined interactions among cancer survivors and thinking through how you're going to talk to people about it. It was interesting that people sort of felt like they had to not just anticipate what people were going to say, but anticipate the questions. And so they had to kind of do some extra research because one of our participants said, it helps to have planned out the same questions that you had about what are you going to do, what's it going to do to you, how long it's going to take, this is what your progress appears to look like, so that they know that up front, because those are the questions that they're going to ask, and if you don't know, you can't reassure them. So you have to kind of come prepared, do your homework before the conversation so that you can manage their uncertainty about it. And then we saw people engaging what we called active message design, which other people have written about. So these are discursive strategies. So you want to be positive, but you also want to be honest. You want to give people hope and maintain that for yourself, but you don't want to lie to them. People talked about drafting messages. So they would write an email for their family and friends, and they would sit on it, and they would edit it so that they could say things the right way. So I'm talking to my colleague, Brad Love, who's a faculty member in the Moody College of Communication with me, and he also studies cancer survivorship. And I'm thinking, I'm like, is this work thing, does this make sense? What do you think? And I'm running it by him. And so he and I have started working on some additional studies to test out this concept. And what we've been arguing is basically that the theory of illness trajectories makes so much sense, and I just think it's really useful, but it was written at a time where perhaps there wasn't as much communication work, because this was the 80s, people weren't going online to find information about their health conditions. There wasn't as much patient empowerment and patient self-management as there is today with chronic illness. There may have been less of, or there may have been more of a paternalistic approach to medicine at that time. And so this idea of having the job of being a communicator and a cancer survivor, I think, has more heuristic value perhaps today. So we're trying to think about communication work and the theory of illness trajectories in the 21st century. And Brad's area of expertise is new media and how cancer survivors use that. So we've been collaborating on some projects looking at issues of communication work in a Web 2.0. This is what we called it in the Journal of Cancer Education. These studies have been specific to the AYA cancer context, and AYA stands for adolescent and young adult cancer survivors. These are folks who've been diagnosed between the ages of 15 and 39, and this is a really tough age because you're too old to be a pediatric cancer patient, and you don't want to be in the pediatric ward, of course, but you're too young to really relate to a lot of the average or typical cancer survivor concerns, because you're perhaps still a college student, you're dating, you're at a very different life course. And these folks have really bad health outcomes. So cancer survivorship has improved for kids and for older people, and for AYAs, it has not gotten any better over the last couple of decades. So we did an analysis, and we had access to an online support group that is supported through the Livestrong Foundation. And we were analyzing some of the posts that people were providing, talking to each other, and looking for instances of the work that they were doing. We saw that people were seeking information to prepare for offline conversations. They would log on and say, how do I talk to my boyfriend about this? Or, I'm not sure, I feel like I disagree with my oncologist, but I don't know how to tell them that. What do you all think? They were also then referring each other. They were saying, well, here's what I did, but then take a look at this as well. So here's an example. This person says, I think everyone on here can really relate to the woefully inadequate information out there on this incredibly important subject. And they're talking about fertility problems, which is a big issue if you've had cancer treatments at a young age. And she says, if this is really important to you, consider delaying treatment and moving quickly to preserve your embryos. Obviously, you, your doctor, and your family need to make the decision that's right for you. But my experience was that it was well worth it. Check the Fertile Hope website, which gets referred to a lot. People really rely on Fertile Hope. Also look online for whoever is the most recommended reproductive endocrinologist, an RE in your area, any support group for people having fertility issues. Ask friends and neighbors who their friends saw about their IVF. Cold call local gynecologist's office, ask for recommendations for an RE. So this gets my attention because I see the work of researching what to do. I see the work of communicating in this forum. Somebody took the time to write this post and offer this, what we would describe as informational support. You're managing the original poster's uncertainty by providing this answer to the question. There's also this collective uncertainty management because lots of people are logging in and seeing this response and then adding to the thread. And most of these threads average about 8 posts, and some go as many as 2 or 3 dozen. And then you're also kind of doing some of the groundwork for this person, but then giving them new, to use the metaphor, assignments, right? So do this, then do this, then do this, and here's more informational work for you to do. And I'm not judgmental about that. I just notice this sort of pattern. So building on kind of the web, the 2.0, the new media platforms for communication work, right now, a couple of my research teams and I are working on a cancer blog content analysis. And this, as far as we know, this will be the largest content analysis of cancer blogs, especially from a communication perspective. We went 50 pages deep into a Google search for cancer blogs, and then we found every cancer blog that was linked to every other cancer blog that came up in that search. And we ended up with about 500 blogs, and we've since culled that down because some of the links don't work anymore, and some of them aren't really about cancer, so we're deleting some from our data set. But we're analyzing these records and these entries, these blog posts, basically as quasi-diary data to see how people are engaging in uncertainty management over time as they're coping, and to see how people are engaging in communication work over time and how those are overlapping. So this is an example of one of our blogs, My Lymphoma Journey. This is Andrew's blog. And this is his About Me page. And I have a couple of bracketed sections here that I'll read to you. I know that's a little bit small. He's saying, after I was diagnosed, I was depressed over the next few weeks. Uncertainty shifted from what do I have to what does it mean. Learning about the MCL on the web made things worse. My prospects appeared bleak, confronting me with my mortality. I had to deepen the level of discussions with family and friends while broadening the circle to include staff and colleagues to let them know my situation. Sharing the news did not become easier with repeated telling, which is consistent with Sharmaz's perspective. One of the things that I grappled with throughout the diagnostic process was, beyond immediate family and friends, who needed to know, when and how much to share, in the very practical question of being absent from work for 6 months at least, as well as deeper discussions with family and friends, I began to realize that while the lymphoma was about me, the impact was upon others that I related with. So then he goes on to talk about how he created this system of weekly updates, and he had this process of keeping everybody posted, everybody updated. He used his blog as this forum. This is Jessica. She is living with stage 4 lung cancer, which is remarkable. She was diagnosed about 2.5 years ago. And she says, I started this blog because I was tiring of telling my story over and over again. So I see that and I'm like, yes, this is hard. Doing the face-to-face disclosure can become tiresome and tedious. And so the blog may be a way of performing the work, provides this communication tool. As I wrote the first post, though, I felt some of the burden lifting from my shoulders. Some days there's a fine line between sharing my honest feelings and depressing the hell out of my friends and family. But most of the time, though, I just tell my story, and I hope to make my readers laugh more than cry. Some of the themes that we're noticing in the work, so what Corbin and Strauss did was they argued that there are lines of work, the illness-related, the biographical, the everyday life, and I would argue the communication, and then within each line there are tasks. So these are more discrete and concrete processes. We see people seeking information, preparing for talk, exchanging information, and sometimes that is laborious. Shaping the conversation, orchestrating things to get it to go a certain way, keeping people updated, managing their own and others' emotions. We see some meta-communicative work. We see people doing the work of the blog, keeping the blog, but then negotiating with their audience, their blog people, and saying, it's too much for me to respond to all of your comments, but I'm going to answer some questions in this post. So I keep thinking about this, and I hope that one of the premises that I'm making clear to you is that I think communication work is one way of thinking about uncertainty management and collective uncertainty management and how it is effortful and how it might be worth it, even though it is so effortful. So in honor of the conference theme, I'm trying to I'm hopeful that the questions that I've already been working on answering seem interesting to you. I know they're interesting to me, and I'll share with you some of the next steps that I think will be interesting questions as well. The theory of illness trajectories is called the theory of illness trajectories because it's actually about this idea of illnesses following a path and having a trajectory. And what Corbin and Strauss were articulating is that there are these ups and downs and there's an eventual decline, and at different points in the trajectory the work changes. And so you may have to do more biographical work at this point in time, or you may have to, your illness work may become more burdensome if you have an acute event that occurs here. You have stable parts of your trajectory where the work becomes kind of routinized, and then you have some that are very disruptive and unstable. And so when we're analyzing our blog data, we are looking to see what else is happening in the cancer trajectory that is related to the communication work that's going on. So has something changed that then makes the updates very important or more challenging? Is there something that is good news that then makes the communication work easier? I don't know, so that's what we're going to be looking at. And then as I mentioned, what are people getting out of this? Corbin and Strauss said that if people are to continue to put forth effort to do this requisite or desired work, there must be some perceived payoff to motivate them to do it. And so we are interested in both the subjective and objective outcomes of communication work. What is the payoff for doing this? I think those of us who study interpersonal relationships can come up with some plausible ones. From a coping perspective, I'm curious as to whether communication work actually feels adaptive and you feel like you're doing something, you're engaging, and so that can give you more control, make you feel like you're able to control something again. It could also be adaptive escape avoidance coping because, there's nothing I can do to make my chemotherapy more tolerable, but there are things I can do to make sure that my friends aren't really stressed out about this, or there are things I can do to help explain this to my work colleagues in a more successful way. I wonder about the extent to which the communication work can really take a toll on people, so a longer term goal would be to look at some actual physiological side effects, I guess you could call it, that, and to the extent to which communication work is a double-edged sword. So there are some good things you get out of it, but there are some dilemmas in that it is taxing. And then finally, I've just been thinking about some of the ethical questions that come up because I'm interested in how we can help people manage their uncertainty, but I'm also very cautious about being too paternalistic about that. As I said, sometimes I get a little bit frustrated when I see mainstream recommendations for cancer survivors or other people who have illnesses that say, well, just talk to your family and friends. And again, those of us who do this know, well, it's not that easy. That sounds really simple. And I wonder, can we minimize the burden? Can we engage cancer social workers? Can we engage patient advocates? As I said, that AYA group that we worked with, they're very active and just really wonderful and energetic. Can we find ways to equip them to minimize the burden of the communication work? But then should we, right? Because then that whole issue of, is it doing something good for them? Are they feeling more robust because there's something they can control and something they could do? So should we actually minimize the work for them? I don't know. Whose job is it? This is a big issue that comes up. This is where the conflict of managing the illness in the illness trajectories theory comes up, is whose job is what? How do we divide that? And what I found really interesting about our initial development of the communication work pillars is that people described this as divisible labor. So we had people say they appointed a family spokesperson because they said, it's too much for me. So they'd say, guess what, everyone, I appreciate the calls, I appreciate the messages, but I am tired and I am busy and I can't answer all of these questions. So Leslie's going to start an email distribution list. If you want to know the updates, send her your address and she will put you on that. Or my husband's going to take all the phone calls. So I'm curious about whose job it should be, which is more of an ethical question than an empirical question. And then I also wonder about the ethical issue of managing other people's uncertainties and trying to help them. I really think this is very well intended and very pro-social. But then I feel like it starts to bleed a little bit into codependency and, well, I'm going to manage your emotions for you and I'm going to tell you how to feel about this and what to take away with it. And, whether you have an empirical beef with the codependency measures of the literature, I do think that that is something just sort of interesting to grapple with. So I love uncertainty. I hope you're interested in it. I hope you learned a few things from our talk, and I'm very grateful for your presence here and happy to answer questions. Of course.
Thank you. I just wanted to say, those of you following online, if you want to ask Dr. Donovan questions, you can do so through Twitter at #BeckerCon14. Also, we're going to start our answer Q&A right now. We're going to end promptly at 10:15 just to give Dr. Phaedra Pizzulo some time to set up. I hope you stick around for her talk. Is there any questions? Okay. Do you mind if I run it over?
Oh, please.
And then
Yeah.
there's perfect.
Is it okay? Hello? Yeah. I'm good, Christina.
I was struck by how self-aware many of the individuals you quoted appeared to be, and I wonder if you could talk, and as a person who comes from a psychological perspective, I was kind of curious about if you could address individual differences, cultural differences. It seems to me those people seemed more intelligent, more self-aware, more self-reflective than is typical, perhaps. So maybe you can talk about that.
Yeah. Well, our focus group and interview sample was small. It was only 40 people, which was enough for the analysis that we were doing. We tried to diversify in terms of cancer site type of diagnosis. We didn't necessarily purposefully sample for diversity in terms of educational background. Most of our participants had either some college or a college degree, so there's that. The extent to which, I'm trying to think how we would pick up on that there was differences in how self-aware they were. I think you're right, and of course I'm sharing with you the quotes that really illustrate the points that we were making. In the focus group interviews, we could probably tap into that more because there were participants who were saying things and it was clear that they were having a hard time making sense of how they really felt about it, and they hadn't put as much time and thought into what their family and friends may be thinking they want to do. And then we had other participants who would then chime in and say, well, it's probably this, or in my family, they were really concerned about this. Maybe that makes sense for you, which is one of the great things about focus group interviews, right, is the participants can feed off of the energy of each other. So yes, there was a little bit of variation. I think if I had to stake a claim, I would probably say that our sample was slightly more self-aware and better educated. I mean, only a quarter of people in Texas have college degrees, so that in and of itself tells you that it's slightly different. Yeah, does that answer your question? Yeah, that's a good point. Ashley?
Can I add on to your question? So thank you for your talk. It was really interesting, and I have 100 questions, and I'll save the other 99 for further conversation. And I'm going to start with a question, and then I'm going to contextualize it. And my question for you is, how do we connect the kinds of communication questions that you're asking to broader scope questions? And I hope that in looking at what Becker inspired, that we cannot know the answer fully to the kinds of places of those connections. So my question for you is, what would you really love to know if you could know anything about how your questions are connected in a broad scope? And I'm going to tie back to your piece on here's how I contextualize this. So you give some examples from blogs, and you give some examples from places where they say things like, sometimes you just don't want to reveal your inner feelings for fear of scaring your family. And then when you see these blogs, you see them go to places of like, here's what you do first, and then second, and then third, and then fourth. And I wonder if this place of like a real fear of who I really am as a person doesn't get translated into a simple reporting of like, here's step 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And that's one of the things, for example, that I wonder, like, how much is fear of the real if I really know the answer to that question, I
Yeah.
can't fully be.
Yeah.
So I come back to that piece of like, are there things that you would hope you can know over the long haul?
Yes, I mean, gosh, there's so many things I wish I knew. So a couple of things. One, so you're absolutely right. Like, people are kind of saying, well, it's not that easy, but then here are some diagnostic principles. So as you said, here's what to do. In some of the online support group data, people are pretty consistently, and I would say this, I think that's such a good observation about the self-awareness. They're pretty self-aware in saying, this is just my experience, this is just my perspective, and they kind of preface most of their advice with that, which again suggests that they're kind of aware of some of the social dynamics, or that's just a norm for that group, that organization. They say, here's my experience, but here's what I would share with you from that. In terms of broader principles, it's not like you can have the most comprehensive theory ever. I'm very interested in how what we are already observing in our data dovetails with what other people have observed in other contexts, right? So it is, now I'm up here like, here are my hopes and my fears. It is my concern always, I don't want to be rehashing something that people have already talked about, right? I don't want to just be giving it a new name. And I think there are some distinct elements here because of the complexities of an illness context. But I'm curious about, for example, there's the concept of emotion labor, right? That already exists, where people in their workplaces, part of what they are paid a wage to do is manage their own emotions so that they can manage other people's emotions. I think there's a connection to be made here. There's people work. So in the occupational literature, people who are in like customer service professions like this, they do this all the time. They have to engage in the labor of dealing with people. And that's what it is for me. This isn't just about, we know that conversations can be difficult. We know that communication can be challenging. But I'm so focused on the effort. And so I think that's, if I had to give you a one-word answer to your question, it would be the effort. And where is the effort located in other theories and other contexts?
Thanks.
I see Kelly, and yes.
I think what I was thank you. What I was thinking in terms of it's kind of a scope question too, because cancer is so pervasive now, but it's not always terminal, thankfully, right? So there's
Right.
a lot of people
Right.
that find out that the outcome is going to be okay in terms of they'll be able to continue living a normal life, or to some degree. And so you talked about this concept of communication work, which is really cool, and some of the goals are to help the confidant, in it. So you're trying to help them do work. How does that shift in terms of when the outcome? I think a lot of that is uncertainty about, are you going to make it or not? Is mom or dad going to make it? And when they get that answer, how does some of the work shift in terms of the patient or the person with cancer? And how might it be different for the types of illnesses where that is not an outcome, where it's very much the impact isn't on the close others, but it's on the person's life. Do you know what I mean? So
Yeah.
both in terms of the support they get when they find that answer, and in terms of how the communication work shifts when that's resolved, at least.
Right, because then I think the focus of your goals for, I don't want to say controlling, but managing other people's reactions shifts, because then what you might want them to really take away from the conversation is, it's not that bad. You hear the C word, and I know the C word is scary, but I want you to know it's not that bad. And I'm curious about whether people, like our data would suggest that people try to have uncertainty managing data to do that. Now we know, for example, like from the psychological literature, that people prefer to receive numerical information about probabilities, but they prefer to communicate kind of general. So people want to hear, well, there's a 60% chance of this, but they want to say there's a good chance of this. So I think you might see some distinctions there. I'm also curious, again, because this work just feels like such a useful metaphor to me. And you're talking about, or what I take away as an example from your example is, so you've had this diagnosis, let's say when you're in your 40s and your 50s, and it's okay, and it's taken care of, right? And you're in remission, you're doing great. The biggest predictor of a serious illness is age. So as you get older, then you're diagnosed with something new or something different or the same condition, I wonder about the practice of having done the work previously. Like, you've done this before. This isn't your first rodeo, right? You've had these difficult conversations. You've had some on-the-job training, right? Like, I could beat this metaphor like a dead horse. But I think that looking at kind of a long term and how we situate this in illnesses that are survivable, I think that practice might be really useful to people. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Thanks, Erin. This is one of the sort of most thought-provoking talks about uncertainty in illness and health that I've heard ever, really. So my mind's going a million directions. But
Mine is too.
as I'm thinking about some of these things and hearing these questions that have also been really helpful, and with you starting with the idea of control, and Tam and I have been thinking about the issue of control and some of the things we're doing with uncertainty, and I love this idea of communication work, et cetera. I'm wondering if the bigger sort of the broader thing that ties us together is an immense loss of control, and it's not only loss of control over your health and your survivability. We feel like we can control, if we do certain things, we can live longer, and that's gone in some way. Some of these folks, it's loss of control over communication work. There are expectations that people give us that you give me updates.
Yes.
There are expectations that every time that you get a new scan that we learn about this. There are sort of layers of loss of control here that also link to emotional labor stuff. I mean, I think this idea of control and how it affects our stress, there's a lot of richness here. And so I'd like to kind of get your thoughts. I also appreciated Isaac tweeted this connection between your talk and John Sloop's talk yesterday about disclosure and control over that spread of information.
Yeah.
So I'd like to get your thoughts on that, I guess.
Well, and one of the things that you mentioned, it makes me think about this notion of responsibility and obligation and a duty to do the communication work and to take up that role. And I think it's useful to consider. I wouldn't have thought about it in terms of control, but I think you're right. Who makes those assignments, right? Most of our participants this was self-assigned work. They were saying, I want to do this for my family. I want to help them because this is going to affect them. One of our confidants said, his dad said, all of our lives are about to change. It just feels so dramatic. But that's one of the reasons why we wanted to do the blog project, because we're curious about the expectations that people have for you to keep going. Like, you have created this site and this platform, and you are not just chronicling what's happening to you, but you are helping other people. And what if you want to resign? Like, what if you're done? What if you don't want to feel like this is an obligation that endures indefinitely? So I appreciate that. Thank you.
We actually have a question from someone who saw you online. They wanted to know, do you find that involving patient advocates affect the uncertainty management?
Involving patient advocates
Like how
in patient care or in my research? That's just what I guess I could take either route with that. So in patient care is probably what they're asking about, because I haven't worked specifically with patient advocates. Yes, if they have useful information. I mean, that's such a broad and not helpful answer. It's like we say in my interpersonal health comm class, I say to my students, like, you're not going to leave this class with the 10 perfect things to say when someone is coping with an illness. Like, they don't exist. What we can do, as all of us in our interpersonal classes do, is try to provide them with general principles. So think about the extent to which this might threaten someone's identity. Think about the extent to which this could seem like very well-intended, sensitive support, and yet it backfires. So if we could equip advocates with some of the tools to help people think about that, then yes. The other thing is, could we just have the advocates do some of the work? Just take it off of the patient's hands, facilitate conversations. Some of my other research is on informed consent and trying to think about how to take the burden off of the patient. But again, it gets back to the ethical question of we want patients to be engaged, so we don't want to just disassociate them from everything. So yes, my answer is yes, but if we can give them good, useful information. So there are a couple of questions that I saw here.
Loved your talk. Thank you so much. And I love the fact that it's qualitative too, because in my own work too, there's just a lot of depth that comes out in that. But then there's also the quantitative half of my brain. And I'm wondering, can you quantify the emotional labor or the emotion work? Because I also made that connection to the emotional labor as you were talking. And I was thinking, how much does it add on top of the person's actual illness? So people who are better able to manage their emotional labor, or what role does your partner take in being able to take some of that away from you as a couple or as a family and actually quantify it? So can you then map that onto a person's illness trajectory and say, these people who do this actually have a better illness trajectory or a worse illness trajectory, like where you can say, and then give them practical advice. So we know that if you do this, your odds of, a cure or recovery or a longer life are going to be, that much better.
Yes. Yeah, I agree. So that's why when we're looking at the blogs and trying to map those instances of work and uncertainty management onto the trajectory, we'll want to see if we can quantify that, right? At least using nominal categories, right? And then my question about the outcomes is exactly what you're thinking. So can we develop a scale to measure how much work people are doing, what different types of tasks they're engaging in, and then is that associated with their coping and their functioning at that time? From kind of an objective perspective, how are they doing? And then B, from a subjective perspective, do they feel like they're getting something rewarding out of that? Because that's why I think it's an ethical issue until we have the data, until we can model it, because say, well, let's minimize the burden, but then what if people feel like that's part of their war story? Is like, I was doing all this and look how well I did it.
It might be cool to follow the same people over time as they modify their emotional labor and the amount of work they do. So what if they get exhausted, then they put it on a blog?
Yeah.
Does that actually help their illness trajectory?
Yeah. Or does it just change the work? Yeah. Great, thank you. We had a question over here that has been up for a while, so I just don't want to ignore it. That's okay, Christina. Someone over here.
I can help readers too.
Okay.
Thanks for your chat.
Thank you.
For your talk. I really enjoyed it. I'm curious to what patients or disclosures might attribute their cancer diagnoses. Because I'm thinking here in the case of Jessica, who said she's never smoked and yet she has lung cancer. Do patients talk about perhaps genetic links? Do they have no idea about where this cancer might be coming from? Do they talk about the environment at all and environmental toxins?
Yes, they talk about all of those things, and they talk about the implications that has for the people in their family. That comes up in the trying to move toward acceptance of what has happened. And then there are people who just have to, as we would say, cope with the uncertainty of not knowing what the etiology of the cancer is, because so often that is the case. And they know what they know. Sometimes they can't even identify the primary site, and so they're going to do the best they can. But yes, that comes up as a source of frustration that I think bleeds into their other coping strategies as well as their talk with others. Yeah, good. Thank you. Andy and...
Thank you. So I really like this idea of communication work, and especially like the idea that the internet can make the work easier to do, but I want to sort of get at the work idea. And from the social support literature, we know an awful lot about, what makes someone good at providing a certain type of message. We know a decent amount about what messages are good from a receiver standpoint, but we don't know very much about what makes someone a good support seeker, or what makes someone willing to do this work. So I just wonder if you had any thoughts about if it's a situational or personal factors that, what gives some more or less ability to work to get the information, the support they want.
Oh, so yeah, I was originally thinking about your question in terms of motivation, but you're thinking ability as well.
Well, I mean, motivation can be in there as well too, for sure. And I think, if we go back to the the support provision, ability and motivation, support reception literature, ability and motivation are both important. So it's likely that ability and motivation are important seeking too.
Right, because the motivation is, well, I am stressed out about this because I don't know. What am I going to do? I need to turn to some help. The ability, I think, and this relates to the patient advocate question, to a certain extent, it's making people aware of some of these forums online. They're not the silver bullet and they're not helpful to everyone, but at least the conversations we've observed, people love having this outlet, especially our AYA survivors, because they just don't know where else to go. And so they can find similar others who can really relate to them. Are some people better able to seek higher quality help? I think is kind of what you're getting at too. And again, relates to the question of self-awareness and health literacy and education. Because when Brad and I look at the online support group data, these are really engaged, smart people. They are thoughtful. They're taking kind of the planful problem-solving approach. Some of them talk about being, researchers, kind of like how I would be, right? How many of us would be like, we would seek information, we would know how to find good information. So yes, I think there's variation there. And as I mentioned, some of our other work has looked at consent and uncertainty management, and health literacy is a big factor, not just education, but how much people actually how well they can make sense of health information and access it and use it. And I think seeking it gets less attention, but I think it's part of that.
Thank you. Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Oh.
Hi, thank you. My question is, it seemed to me that with most of the folks that you've been looking at, there's an assumption that their family members and friends are mostly supportive of them. And so I wonder, like in the lung cancer example, what if somebody has cancer, at least it's perceived because of particular lifestyle kinds of choices, like they are a smoker and they've gotten cancer, or it's because of, their diet or alcohol or whatever. What happens to the way that they perceive the need to kind of manage their communication if they're potentially expecting maybe some kinds of hostile reactions, or if their families are frustrated with them, or if they're continuing the behaviors that were unhealthy to begin with. So I don't know if that's something that you can even account for, but I'm just curious about if there's potentially conflict involved in those.
I think there's a complexity involved. I don't have the specific data to answer that question entirely, but yes, so certain types of cancer are more stigmatized than others, and lung cancer is the best example, and one of the first things people will ask you is, how did you get it? Were you a smoker? And so my hunch is, given what we've read, that people will, part of the obligation and the duty is going to be less about getting people not to be so worried and fearful, and there'll be more of an aspect of getting people not to judge you so much, and finding ways to communicate that and also to come to terms with it and maybe just accept that people are going to have questions like that. Can you find sort of a packaged answer to frame it for people? Is that a conversation, again, kind of go back to the avoidance issue, do you not really want to get into that with people? Do you feel like that's not really any of their business? So yes, and there's also variation just in terms of like the family structure and as you said, how supportive families are. Some of our bloggers don't get good support from their families, and some of our bloggers have these amazing partners and support systems, and some don't, and so the blog is their outlet, and then they connect with people online, and one of the reasons why they do it is because they can make these friends because they're not getting it offline.
All right, well, thanks a lot, Erin. I asked Christina, thanks Christina, I asked Christina to give me the mic for the final couple minutes, only because periodically what we're going to be sort of announcing, letting people know, is that we're hoping to continue this conversation after the conference, and the research office has funded this conference and also suggested that there may be some funding for pilot projects that emerge from this conference that are interdisciplinary in nature and intermethod and mixed method in nature, et cetera. So at any time during the conference, if you decide that you'd like to take part in these conversations, what we'll basically be doing is once we have a list, we'll be contacting folks in the list and meeting and hopefully developing 4 or so research groups that develop white papers. The key is that they're interdisciplinary. And so if you're interested in that, just email at any point. You can email becker-conference@uiowa.edu. Mention that you'd like to be on the email list, and we'll make sure to include you once this is all done. So I just wanted to thank Erin again for the fantastic talk, and looking forward to Phaedra's talk next. So thanks, Erin.